It's time to get started on our first chapter. And so, like any textbook, the first chapter is always going to be like a huge mishmash of every kind of idea that will ever be inside of the course. And so, as we go through these right now, I don't want you to worry about understanding every single idea because that's kind of what we're going to spend the next 16 weeks doing is learning how to understand all these ideas. But what this is going to do is give you kind of a broad overview of the kinds of stuff that we're going to talk about in this class. And so, first, genetics is the study of heredity and variation. When you take like general biology 1, general biology 2, or human anatomy 1, human anatomy 2, those classes are doing a lot of describing just what is there, like what makes a human, what are the body systems, what are the organs that exist within the circulatory system, for example, or what are the organisms that make up the tree of life. Genetics is more about why things are that way, which is why I love it. I love this class so much because we get it why things are the way that they are. But it's this unifying discipline in biology because we're talking about all different levels of complexity with life. We could be talking about things at like the atomic level, up to the molecular level, up to then like organismal or population wide. And so it's this very unifying discipline that's kind of getting at like why are things the way that they are from multiple kinds of perspectives, whether we're talking about disease or evolution or the tree of life, just why are things the way that they are? And so when we say the way that they are, a lot of times what we're talking about are traits. And so if you were to say that, humans come in all different shapes and sizes, by that you're probably referencing the shapes and sizes of humans, which are going to be traits. Those are things that you can see. It's something that an organism displays that is going to have some causal reason why it is that way, which is going to be the genes. But genetics, again, is looking at this molecular expression of genes. How do you go from a gene to something that you can actually see with your eyeballs or that an organism might experience as they live their life in the world? And so when we talk about traits, how did we get there? That's a big jump, right? Because the sequence of DNA is going to be these these bases that are inside of the DNA. But then when we actually get to the trait could be anything from like eye color to we'll list over here. Eye color, hair texture, height. It could also be a particular disease or maybe an ability, a special ability that an organism has. And so, how do you get from point A to point B? How do you get from the gene to the trait? And again, that is genetics. That's what we look at. And so, traits in general, particularly for multicellular organisms, are going to come from cells. So, there's going to be some cell that is doing something in some special way that goes on to produce that trait. And all cells are built from four different macromolecules. And so, this is from your earlier courses, but you got to remember this stuff, hopefully, that is everything in life is built from four macromolecules, which are nucleic acids, proteins, carbohydrates, and lipids. So, of those four, they got different purposes. Nucleic acids are DNA and our RNA. Proteins primarily are enzymes. Carbohydrates are what we can use for to produce energy, sugars. And then lipids usually are used for longer term energy storage or they are structural and that we find them inside of cell membranes. And so those are the four macromolecules that are somehow doing something in the cell, which is then going to eventually produce a trait in an organism. And so each of those four macromolecules is going to play a role in building a cell, which has organelles, and those organelles are going to perform a function. And that function altogether will build what we call the proteome. And so the genome is what we use to describe all of the genetic information in an organism, all of the DNA and RNA is the genome. But then that genome will go on to produce the proteome. So the proteome are all of the proteins that a cell makes at a given time. And the proteins of those four macromolecules, in terms of genetics, those proteins are going to be the most important because the proteins, again, are this workhorse of the cell and they build stuff. Most proteins are enzymes. And so if we're talking about a cell that let's imagine it's going to go on to produce like a rougher texture inside of hair. And so those individual strands of hair are going to be produced by cells, and all hair is made of proteins. And so the proteins are the thing that are going to be the difference. And when we talk about genetics, sometimes we can have a change in DNA or RNA that doesn't actually affect the proteome. And so because of that, the proteome will remain unchanged, and then the cell is going to remain unchanged, then the trait is going to remain unchanged, even though the DNA isn't actually the same. And so in order for us to get these changes in traits, ultimately we have to have some kind of change to the proteome of a cell. And again, the proteome are going to be proteins. Most proteins are enzymes that perform chemical reactions or speed up chemical reactions. And so that's why they're so important when it comes to the traits we observe in an organism. DNA is what is going to code for all proteins, which again are all enzymes, which again are the proteome. And DNA is going to be comprised of a series of bases, nitrogenous bases that are going to be within the nucleotides. So hopefully this is all review from earlier classes that you've taken, your prerequisite courses. Hopefully remember some of these. And DNA's got four bases, A, T, C, G. RNA also has four bases, except that instead of a T, there's a U with uracil. But we're going to have this genetic code, and we're going to come back and talk about this over and over again throughout the semester. But in General Biology 1, General Biology 2, Anatomy 1, Anatomy 2, you should have talked about how DNA becomes RNA, and RNA turns into a sequence of amino acids. And that sequence of amino acids is what will build the proteins. So all of that DNA is physically located on chromosomes, and chromosomes are something that would have been mentioned in your earlier courses that they exist and that they're inside of the nucleus. But we're going to talk a lot more about how a chromosome is actually structured, what a chromosome really is. And when you look at a picture like this, what does it even mean? And so we're not going to do all that this second. We are going to go through it over time. But chromosomes can change. You can duplicate chromosomes. You can lose chromosomes. Chromosomes can like swap information from one to another one. So what does that mean when that occurs? And we'll talk about kind of how that works inside of the cell. We've got this part about how our genes are going to become proteins, which is the central dogma of biology, that we go from DNA to RNA to proteins. And this is something, again, we're going to talk about in detail as we move through the class. And then when we talk about traits, there's different types of traits. And the type of trait, that the category of trait that it is, also is informative of what must have occurred at the molecular level to produce that trait. And so we can have morphological traits. Those are going to be traits that affect the appearance of an organism. It's going to look different. Physiological traits, where maybe you got two organisms, they look exactly the same, but something is different about their physiology. Maybe it's something about like their metabolism. So a real easy one would be like your ability to metabolize a particular sugar, let's say lactose. And so if you're able to metabolize lactose, that means that you are going to be lactose tolerant. But then if you cannot metabolize lactose, you're lactose intolerant, that is a physiological trait. It doesn't really affect anything about the way that you look. Behavioral traits. So how do certain organisms respond to the environment? Here we've got birds, but another behavioral trait example would be like autism spectrum disorders, for example. So if someone has ADHD, what are the molecular causes of that kind of behavior? And so these are all different sorts of traits. Again, being able to describe generally, is it a morphological, physiological, or behavioral trait will kind of help you start to talk about what is the molecular cause of that trait. The expression of genes is going to influence those traits. And again, it's because these genes could present at the molecular, cellular, organism, or population level. And so we've got to understand those levels of organization. And we will talk about those throughout the course. Sometimes we'll talk about genetics in terms of, individual birth defects or individual birth abilities, or we'll talk about them in terms of the population level. So like the evolution of an entire population and how does that happen at a genetics level. In order to get any kind of evolution, though, you need variation. And so variation is a very important part of biology. Evolution relies on populations having variation inside of them. Humans come in all different shapes and sizes for all sorts of great reasons. And so how does that variation happen without the same time causing defects? Because a defect is technically just variation, right? And are defects always defects? What determines if variation is good or bad? Usually it's the environment. But how does that happen? How do we get this kind of variation? We're going to talk about gene mutations, where we've got one base that might be changed. That's a mutation, but it could be changes in overall chromosome structure, which means that now we're not talking about one base. We could be talking about hundreds of thousands of bases because an entire chromosome can be infected, and that can be in the structure of one individual chromosome or changes to the overall number of chromosomes. And what is that going to do to our overall traits that we see in an organism? We have this interaction between genes and the environment because sometimes you might have an organism that has the exact same DNA as another, yet their traits are different. And it's because of what was going on in the environment, maybe earlier on in development. And so when we're looking at variation, how much of that variation is caused by the underlying genetic molecular mechanisms and how much of that variation is caused by changes in the environment. And so we'll talk about some examples of that. We've got some papers that we're going to read that help us understand that. An example would be PKU. Here's an example. You can read about it. But this is just a success story about how understanding genetics can then help improve the lives of people. Gregor Mendel is someone hopefully you heard about in your early prerequisite classes. He's kind of our father of genetics, and then he was the one who developed a lot of these underlying laws. But the sorts of things that Mendel was able to show right now seem very simple, but the reason that he's so important is because he was able to describe that when we see variation in a population, it isn't just random mishmash, this, that variation all over the place for no reason. That there are universal rules and laws and reasons why we can observe changes in a population of organisms and why other times it's more stable. And it's not just random changes for no reason within a population. We're going to talk about inheritance patterns. How are things inherited? How do you know if something is going to be inherited? This is an example of a human because in any human, we've got 46 total chromosomes. Those chromosomes are arranged in these things that we call homologous pairs. So we're going to talk about what a homologous pair is and how that's different from sister chromatids and the position of the centromere and what that might mean in terms of one chromosome versus another. So we'll go through these karyotypes like this, and we'll look at the differences in somatic cells versus gametic cells. I really love evolution, so I love talking about evolution from this genetics perspective. And a lot of times when we're talking about overall rules that govern genetics in all life, we are going to talk about some model organisms. So we're going to read through several papers that are going to use a lot of these model organisms, and they're very helpful because a lot of times the model organisms already have an entirely mapped genome. We know all of their DNA. We know what all of their DNA does, and a lot of times that is very helpful when designing experiments. We've got three broad types of genetics. And again, we're going to look at examples of these. One would be transmission genetics to understand how traits pass from parents to offspring. And this is kind of one of the more classical types of genetics in which we're trying to understand why do offspring turn out the way that they do given the traits of their parents? How do those traits move from one parent to the offspring? And why do some traits sometimes remain the same and sometimes do they change? This can be really important if you're doing stuff like selective breeding, which is used for agriculture, and understanding why traits are going to move from the parents to the offspring. And a lot of the examples and the problems that we work are going to be with this type of transmission genetics. There's molecular genetics. This is, more recent, and this is understanding how is it specifically not just that information is transmitted, but at the molecular level, like why is it that one DNA sequence gives you one trait and another DNA sequence would give you another one? What is happening inside of the cell that is causing that change? And so if you're talking about like how does someone develop a tumor? Where does cancer come from? This would be the branch, the type of genetics you'd be interested in is why does that mutation cause this tumor? What happened? What happened to that person that caused the mutation to pop up? And then why is this particular mutation the one that's resulting in the tumor, not another? And so that would be molecular genetics. Finally, we got population genetics. So this is more of like, how is a population changing over time? And what are the reasons for that? One of these may be, I wear glasses. I've worn glasses since I was in the third grade. And overall, I remember talking to the last time I got my eye exam, asking her about this, is just like, are people are more and more people getting glasses? And the answer is yes. Number of nearsighted kids is soaring. Nearsighted again means you can see close, but you can't see far away. And that has to do with screens and with devices, but it also has to do with how much time we're spending indoors instead of outdoors. And so this would be like population level changes. And we have known about molecular and transmission genetics long enough that there's some really cool stuff that's happening lately with population genetics because we now know more about these traits. But this would be looking overall, what kind of traits are becoming more or less popular or abundant in a population and why? The other really cool part about genetics is that it is an experimental science. We're going to again read many different articles from primary literature, real scientific articles, and it is a science where you can develop a hypothesis, go out, test your hypothesis, get numbers that show that your hypothesis is supported or rejected, and you know something in the end. You're not just observing the world necessarily. You can manipulate things with genetics experiments and see how they affect traits in the organism. And so it really is a really cool science in that way. Because some branches of science you can't do experiments. Let's imagine you're doing like you study black holes. You can do some experiments in the lab, but it's not like you can have three different black holes next to each other and manipulate them or something. Same with certain types of experiments, just with humans. There's certain experiments that, would be really informative, but we just can't do them because it would be unethical. And so, genetics, oftentimes, you can do lots of really cool experiments with these model organisms that you can't do in other branches of science. And so, in that way, it's really cool science. And it's something really interesting to read about. And so, I really love teaching this class. It's a really fun class to teach. We have our pacing guide where you're going to see the different stuff that we're going to be doing. But I'm excited to start the semester, and I think you're going to have fun. This is a cool class.